we move on to the next item of business, which is Stage 3 proceedings for the Land Reform Scotland Bill. In dealing with the amendments, members should have the bill as amended as Stage 2, that is SP Bill 44A, the marshalled list and the groupings of amendments. The division bell will sound and proceedings will be suspended for around 5 minutes for the first division of the Stage 3. The period of voting for the first division will be 30 seconds, and thereafter I will allow a voting period of 1 minute for the first division after a debate. Members who wish to speak in the debate on any group of amendments, please press the Request to Speak button or enter RTS in the chat as soon as possible after the group has been called. Members should now refer to the marshalled list of amendments. And we move to Group 10, Lotting Decisions. I call Amendment 175 in the name of the Cabinet Secretary, grouped with amendments as shown in the groupings. The Cabinet Secretary to move Amendment 175 and speak to all amendments in the group.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I propose to speak to the amendments in my name before turning to others in the group. Amendment 175 will require a declaration to be included in the deeds of transfer for land where the lotting provisions apply to confirm the transfer isn't in breach of any lotting prohibition. And this responds to feedback from Registrars of Scotland, who highlighted that this change would increase transparency and better enable the keeper to perform their land registration functions. Amendment 191 removes the requirement for expert advice to be sought for every lotting decision following a review, replacing this with a duty on ministers to consider whether it's appropriate to seek this advice. This change will enable more simple review decisions, so, for example, that could be a minor boundary change requested by the landowner to take place more rapidly. That will minimise delay to sales while still ensuring that advice is sought for more complex decisions. I oppose Edward Mountain's amendments 185, 67, 68 and 69 because they would have the opposite effect, making it more difficult to obtain expert advice and delaying decisions. Now, my final amendment in this group is a minor drafting correction to clarify that ministers should publish the latest version of guidance on lotting decisions as soon as practicable after issuing it. And I recommend that members support all the amendments in my name. Turning to other amendments in this group, Amendment 65 in the name of Rhoda Grant would clarify that ministers will take into account land being occupied as a croft, agricultural tenancy or small landholding when making a lotting decision. And I'd be happy to support this amendment, as well as Amendment 187, which requires ministers to have regard to the public interest in preparing guidance on lotting decisions. Michael Matheson and Ariane Burgess's amendments in this group both focus on the provision of information relating to lotting decisions, particularly to community bodies. And I'm happy to support Michael Matheson's amendments. I do have concerns that Ariane Burgess's amendments would require ministers and the Land and Communities Commissioner to share reports with any community body that they consider might have an interest in purchase. Now, the pre-notification measures in the bill will already allow community bodies to be informed at the outset of the process, and they'll also allow community bodies to apply to purchase only part of the land. And ministers could then take this into account when considering the lotting decision. Now, Michael Matheson's amendment will ensure that information about lotting decisions is provided to people who have provided details and wish to be informed of the proposals for sale under the pre-notification provisions. And this is a more proportionate and workable approach. So for these reasons, while I do have sympathy with the intention, I would encourage Ariane Burgess not to press amendments 293, 294, 299, 302 and 392. Turning to the amendments on timescales, I'm happy to support Tim Eagle's Amendment 14 on appeal timescales and his amendments 189, 190 and 192, which impose timescales within which ministers must complete a review of a lotting decision and, if necessary, make a replacement lotting decision. At a review decision, ministers will have access to the information that supported the initial decision, meaning that a timescale of 3 months is reasonable. However, I oppose Edward Mountain's amendments 63 and 64, applying this 3-month timescale to an initial lotting decision and removing the related provision in section 67N7. It is important that timescales do allow for more complex cases where engagement with the landowner, local communities and provision of expert advice from a land agent would be required. Now, in terms of some of the other amendments in this group, Tim Eagle's Amendment 260 doesn't have an effect because the tests set out for lotting decisions in the bill would already allow ministers to consider wider public interest decisions without that text being being added. And similarly, his Amendment 298 appears to clarify that compensation may be payable when land is not lotted, but that's already covered under the first ground for compensation, which is already set out in the bill as drafted. So I would ask members to oppose these amendments, as well as the rest of the amendments in this group from Tim Eagle, Edward Mountain and Douglas Lumsden. The majority of these were voted on and rejected at stage 2, and ultimately they undercut the policy aims of the bill. Thank you.
Thank you. I call Edward Mountain to speak to Amendment 59 and other amendments in the group.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. I have 20 amendments in this group, so I'll try and be as brief as possible. My amendments in this group make the proposed lotting process fairer and more sensible for all parties. They enable the applicant to propose their own lotting plan, helping tackle situations in which the landowner may be selling as a result of financial hardship, and to streamline and help ministers. Amendments 59 and 62 enable the applicant to propose the lots within their application and oblige ministers to have regard to the lotting plan when they make the lotting decisions. Ministers, of course, would not be bound by the plan, so there's no real downside to allowing and approving this amendment. Amendments 66, 70, 73 and 74 would set out the owner's proposed lotting plan would be considered at different stages of the lotting decision process, appeal and any court consideration. Amendment 60 obliges the ministers to rule that land need not be transferred in lots when the owner is facing financial hardship. I think that's fair and equitable. Amendment 185 means that such lotting decisions where the owner is facing financial hardship must be made with the help of a qualified specialist who has experience in the local area. Amendment 66 inserts a subsection enabling the applicant to propose lots during the review of a lotting decision, and Amendment 70 just obliges the minister to consider this plan. Amendment 63 reduces the period ministers have to make a lotting decision from 6 to 3 months, in a similar vein to Tim Eagle's Amendment 189, which I hope the Cabinet Secretary will support. Amendment 67 ensures that the individual from whom the minister seeks advice on the lotting decision is certified qualified, rather than just appearing to the ministers to be certified qualified. Amendment 68 ensures that that person has knowledge of the land market in the local area. Both of these are sensible amendments. In my experience, you could get somebody in from one area of Scotland to another area of Scotland and have they no idea of the different land market. Amendment 186 links the minister's lotting decision to land management plans and local place plans and requires ministers to determine that land need not be transferred in lots where lotting is not identified in the land management plan or the local place plan, both of which will have been approved. This amendment would increase the value and meaningfulness, in my mind, of land management plans and local place plans, both of which I believe were supported earlier on in this process. Amendment 77 is a technical amendment relating to the amendment of 186. Amendment 291 inserts the provision that lotting is considered to be not in the public interest if it reduces the ability to achieve net zero emissions. You can't lot a place if it's going to stop us, in my mind, Cabinet Secretary, reach the net zero targets that the government are committed to. Amendments 71 and 72 would oblige ministers to offer to buy the land if the lotting decisions they makes the land less commercially attractive. Seems fair to me. Amendment 193 further clarifies that ministers' offer to buy land must be specified at an open market value as determined by the appointed valuer or lands tribunal. That again is fair. Amendment 64 holds the ministers to account regarding the time periods they face in this section. Turning to other amendments in the group, very briefly, Presiding Officer, Amendment 175 in the name of the Cabinet Secretary I don't believe is required. In terms of Amendment 191, I find it strange that a minister at the time that decisions are going to be made in relation to this might have no experience of land sales or lotting, feels they're in a position to make a decision without seeking expert advice. I cannot believe they are considering removing this from, as it decreases their ability to stand up to legal challenge, which would therefore significantly increase cost. Amendment 392, in the name of Ariane Burgess, is an administrative amendment which I don't believe is required. Amendments 292 and 306, in the name of Douglas Lumsden, a sensible amendment because lottings will, without doubt, result in unemployment, and ministers should be held financially accountable if they demand the land is lotted. Amendments 189, 190 and 192 in the name of Tim Eagle are eminently sensible as well. I'm not going to go any further into that because I think I may have expended my time limit, Presiding Officer.
Thank you, Mr Mountain. And I now call Douglas Lumsden to speak to Amendment... Oh, I'm terribly sorry, I don't. I call Tim Eagle. I was so taken aback by Mr Mountain's kind remarks. I call Tim Eagle to speak to Amendment 290 and other amendments in the group. Mr Eagle.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. Can I just thank the Cabinet Secretary for some clarification around Amendment 290 there, actually. I think that's welcome, and in light of those remarks, I won't push that amendment today. I also thank the Cabinet Secretary for her and her team, actually, for working with me on Amendments 189, 190, 192 and 14. These amendments relate to timescales for decisions following a review. They will require ministers to complete a review of a lotting decision and, if necessary, make a replacement lotting decision within 3 months of an application for review. And Amendment 14 will increase the time available to a landowner to make an appeal against a ministerial decision on compensation from 21 to 28 days. And I hope the rest of the Chamber can get behind those today. Now, my Amendment 296, as currently drafted, the bill allows the landowner to seek compensation from ministers for loss or expense that is related to a lotting decision, where that decision has stated that land can only be transferred in lots. My Amendment 296 makes that condition clearer, stating that compensation can be claimed in relation to a lotting decision. In the intervening period of a lotting decision being made, the owner may have suffered losses they would not otherwise had, and had it not been for the delay caused by a lotting decision. This amendment ensures that any lotting decision which has caused the landowner loss or expense can be eligible for compensation. Having said that, however, my Amendments 2 and 3 seek to delete all of the lotting provisions from the bill. Lotting prevents landowners from selling large landholdings in full, and instead will see such landholdings sold in parts known as lots. Ministers appear to be trying to apply a solution to what they have perceived as land inequality, to the detriment of the existing rural economy. The bill makes what I have always maintained is a very dangerous assumption that if you are a landowner operating at scale, then you are creating problems. This is not the case. The realities of land management and farm production have forced people to scale holdings for their survival, and some of Scotland's most extensive land holdings are also, in some areas, our most vulnerable. Lotting could see landowners deal with further administrative requirements and financial burdens. Transfers of land would also be delayed, and perhaps most concerningly, the value of land may decline. This means that viable businesses will be fractured, confidence could decline, and there is a very real possibility that interest in investment could also reduce. In recent days, following a letter from two very prominent thinkers around land reform, there have been very real questions raised about whether this part of the bill is ultra vires or out with the competence of Scottish ministers. If their assessment proves correct, we should all be very worried. Therefore, to ensure the protection, stability and future of our rural economy, I propose to remove the lotting provisions in this bill to ensure perceived historical unfairness is not fixed by a damaging policy. I urge the Cabinet Secretary and members not to push forward with the lotting conditions. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr Eagle. I now call Douglas Lumsden to speak to Amendment 292 and other amendments in the group. Mr Lumsden.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. In speaking to Amendments 292 and 306, I want to echo the concerns raised by one of my constituents in North East Scotland, and one that I know the Cabinet Secretary is familiar with as her constituent too. D Ward manages land in Angus Glens, employing local people in delivering public goods like food, energy, climate mitigation, nature restoration and housing. Now, Dee wrote powerfully in the Times about the reality of this bill. There was no rhetoric in his words, just the real-world impact on people, jobs and the environment that depend on Scotland's rural estates. He said, the government says it cares about rural communities and wants to grow the rural economy. Yet at the same time, through this bill, ministers are preparing to fragment rural businesses that are doing exactly those things, creating employment, producing food, providing homes for working families. There is an obvious inconsistency here. On one hand, the Scottish Government praises sustainable land management and environmental restoration. On the other, it's putting forward measures that would force those very operations to be carved up and sold off in pieces, with no thought for the livelihoods, the projects or the progress that would be lost. D Ward made the point clearly. Integrated land use at scale allows estates like his to fund vital environmental work, from flood management to biodiversity improvements. Break that scale apart and you don't just risk economic loss, you risk environmental backsliding. And that's why I brought forward Amendment 292, which is about fairness and accountability. If ministers decide to intervene and force a lotting decision, and if they decide that land may only be transferred in lots, they must also accept responsibility for the consequences of that decision. If people lose their jobs because ministers dictate how land must be sold, then it's only right that the government bears the cost of those redundancies, not the businesses and workers who have no say in the matter. Amendment 306 is consequential to this, ensuring the legislative framework properly captures the new section. We should all want Scotland where land delivers for people, nature and the economy, but that future won't come from punishing those who are already delivering or by imposing policies that make investment in rural Scotland a risk not worth taking. These amendments do not undo the bill. They simply ensure that if government takes powers to intervene in the marketplace, it also accepts responsibility for the human consequences of its decisions. And I sincerely urge colleagues to support Amendments 292 and 306 to protect the fairness. Amendment 295 and 297 will provide some incentive for ministers to adhere to timescales when making lotting decisions, and I believe will add important safeguards to the bill. At stage 2, the Cabinet Secretary responded to pressure to add timescales for lotting decisions in new sections of the bill. However, she then went on to negate a lot of the benefit of having a timescale by adding that failure to adhere to that timescale would not affect the validity of anything done by ministers under those sections. Now, while I can understand the argument that lotting decision itself should remain valid in order to avoid even further delay, there should still be some consequence when ministers are slow to act, because further delay in this process are likely to cause loss and further detriment to the landowner or potentially future buyers of land. My Amendment 295 would ensure that where a lotting decision is appealed, the court may have regard to ministers' delay. I'm not attempting to bind the court, but the delay is something it may have regard to. Amendment 297 would require ministers or the Lands Tribunal, as the case may be, to have regard to any delay in determining whether compensation is payable. Land transactions will already be significantly slowed down due to the operation of this part of the bill, and we've heard serious concerns raised by not just landowners but the banking sector and professional agents about the impacts that may have on wider land market in Scotland if the liquidity of land as an asset to secure borrowing is negatively affected. Without an incentive for ministers to act timelessly, that can only be exacerbated, and that will have a knock-on impact on the ability for landowners and farmers borrow funds to invest, create much-needed growth and rural employment. So I would ask members to agree to these amendments as a small but necessary check and balance of ministers' powers. Thank you, Presiding Officer.
Thank you, Mr Lumsden. I now call Ariane Burgess to speak to Amendment 392 and other amendments in the group. Ms Burgess.
Thank you. In discussions with the Cabinet Secretary, I've expressed my doubts about the effectiveness of lotting as it is drafted. To improve it, I've introduced Amendments 392, 293 and 294, which will enable the Commissioner to share the lotting report with local communities who may wish to purchase lots and make a more informed decision. And my thanks to Community Land Scotland for their support with these amendments. Access to the Land and Communities Commissioner report will be vital for communities to decide whether or not they want to pursue a purchase of one of the lots. There is no reason why that report could not be shared with the local community as defined through the prior notification process or by the Land and Communities Commissioner. A report will be shared with the landowner and Scottish ministers. If prior notification and lotting provisions are to function effectively and deliver greater transparency and community ownership, it is important that communities are given access to as much information as possible. Now, case in point is the controversial sale of an estate in the Sleat Peninsula in Skye by the Clan Donald Land Trust. As the landowner, Clan Donald decided to lot the estate for commercial reasons, but neither they nor their agents gave the community access to the relevant information in a timely manner so that the community could make an informed decision about whether a purchase was possible. And the community ultimately decided not to pursue a purchase, but they had not been given the proper opportunity to assess their options. This bill could in some ways assist with this issue through the prior notification mechanism, but if communities are to make full use of lotting decisions, they also need to be informed about how and why any lotting decision has been made and the resulting impact on their potential ownership of the lotted land. Overall, however, I would be interested to hear from the Cabinet Secretary in winding up what the evidence base is for this particular approach to lotting, given the entire burden is now placed on the seller rather than the proposal from the Scottish Land Commission, which would have created a forward-looking process to ensure community sustainability over the long term.
Thank you, Ms Burgess. I now call Rhoda Grant to speak to Amendment 65 and other amendments of the group. Ms Grant.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Amendment 65 will make sure that ministers bring forward guidance on lotting decisions. This must include information on how they will consider crofts, agricultural tenancies and small holdings on the land. This amendment ensures that crofting and tenanted agricultural land are explicitly considered when Scottish ministers decide whether and how to divide land into lots, and I hope the guidance will ensure that ministers don't approve land division in a way that may disrupt crofting communities, farms and ongoing agricultural use, avoiding arbitrary divisions that could harm rural livelihoods. Amendment 187 imposes a public interest test on lotting decisions. The lotting mechanism within the transfer test are a potentially vital way of diversifying ownership and reducing concentration of ownership in specific local areas. As such, mechanisms need to be strengthened and enhanced at this stage of the bill. A crucial means of doing this is to have further detail on the face of the bill around the guidance which underpins lotting decisions and what it may contain, and the importance and centrality of a public interest test. This includes reference to how Scottish ministers must have regard to community wealth building, local housing provision and furthering community ownership, amongst other things. This would make it more transparent from the outset for landowners, community, the Land and Communities Commissioner, and Scottish ministers what type of considerations should underpin lotting decisions, and hopefully it will help smooth decision making and mitigate any disagreements. We're supportive of Ariane Burgess' Amendment 392, which allows the Commissioner flexibility as to the bodies that may receive a copy of the report, and as we know, bodies that would have an interest in land may vary depending on local circumstances.
Thank you, Ms Grant. And I call Michael Matheson to speak to Amendment 298 and other amendments of the group. Mr Matheson.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. Amendments 298, 300, 301 and 303 in my name seek to provide greater transparency around the lotting process. They seek to do this by ensuring that people who may intend to set up a community body or may be in the process of doing so or may have recently done so are given early notice of a lotting decision. These amendments will achieve this by requiring Scottish ministers to give information about lotting decisions to any person who has recorded an interest in being notified of possible transfers of land under the Bill's pre-notification provisions. This is in addition to, of course, a copy of the lotting decision also being provided to the owner of a creditor. These amendments, I believe, Deputy Presiding Officer, will provide greater transparency around lotting decisions and will allow information to be shared with communities who may be impacted by them.
Thank you, Mr Matheson. And I now call the Cabinet Secretary to wind up.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Just a few brief comments. I think touching on Tim Eagle's comments first of all, I think on Amendment 296, I do just want to emphasise that the compensation he's looking for in relation to that amendment is already covered by the provisions that are in 67V1 of the bill. And I do think in terms of some of the other comments he's made and the amendments that would be removing sections and provisions in the bill, I think that would be to ignore the impact that the concentration of land ownership has on our communities across Scotland, and ultimately ignoring the recommendations and work of the Land Commission on which the proposals in the bill are based. In response to the point that was put to me by Ariane Burgess, I think some of this we did cover in the discussion in Group 2, but I understand there were provisions in there in various amendments to look for us to impose a test on the buyer. Again, we did set out the rationale for the approach that we'd taken in the bill within the policy memorandum, because there are a whole host of complexities in relation to some of those tests, whether that's in relation to compensation provisions, the bigger interference with A1P1. But again, that's why we've set out the test and the transfer test in the way that we have in the bill. Now, I appreciate that there are wider concerns about how these provisions are going to work. They are new, but this is a very important step forward in our land reform journey, so I hope members can get behind my amendments. Sorry, Presiding Officer, I was just closing and I want to move Amendment 175.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. The question is that Amendment 175 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? The Parliament is not agreed. There will be a division. And as this is the first division of the Stage 3 today, I suspend for around 5 minutes to allow members to access the digital voting system. Thank you.